Everyone assumes two different colored eyes are just a random roll of the genetic dice, a quirky inheritance passed down like brown hair or freckles. But that assumption is wrong, and what's really happening inside the iris involves everything from silent mutations to a phenomenon so strange. Some people are secretly carrying the DNA of a twin they never knew existed. For centuries, people who were born with one blue eye and one brown eye, or with a strange burst of a second color hiding inside a single iris, were treated like walking mysteries. In some cultures, they were seen as blessed, as though they had been touched by something otherworldly and given a small, permanent mark of good fortune. In others, they were feared, avoided, or whispered about as if they carried some kind of supernatural sign, a warning rather than a gift. Folk tales across different regions told stories about people with mismatched eyes being able to see into two different worlds at once, one eye tuned to the world of the living, and the other somehow tuned to something beyond it. None of that, of course, holds up to any scientific scrutiny, but it says something about how deeply unusual this trait has always seemed to the human eye, pun very much intended. For most of history, nobody had the tools to explain what was actually happening beneath the surface of the iris, so people filled that gap with legend instead of biology. Today, we finally have the tools. Modern genetics, cell biology, and decades of carefully documented medical case studies have cracked open the real explanation. And it turns out the truth is far more fascinating and far stranger in places than any old superstition ever managed to imagine. Let's start with the basics, because you can't understand why eyes end up two different colors until you understand why eyes have color at all. The color of your iris comes down to a pigment called melanin, the same pigment responsible for the color of your skin and hair. The more melanin packed into the front layers of your iris, the darker your eyes appear. Brown eyes are loaded with melanin. Green and hazel eyes carry a moderate, uneven amount. Blue eyes have very little melanin at all, and the blue color you see isn't even a pigment in the way brown is. It's actually a trick of physics, similar to why the sky looks blue. Light entering a low melanin iris scatters in a particular way, and that scattering reflects back as blue, even though there's barely any blue pigment present at all. For a long time, scientists believed eye color worked like a simple genetic switch, similar to what you might have learned in a school biology class. Brown was dominant, blue was recessive, and two blue-eyed parents could never produce a brown-eyed child. Full stop. End of story. It was a tidy explanation, easy to teach and easy to remember, and for decades, textbooks presented it as settled fact. The problem is that real families kept producing results that broke the rule. Two blue-eyed parents occasionally had a child with hazel or even light brown eyes, something the simple single-gene model had no way of explaining. Researchers eventually realized that the old model wasn't wrong because the underlying biology had changed. It was wrong because it had never been complete to begin with. Eye color was never controlled by one gene acting alone. It was always the product of many genes working in concert, and scientists simply hadn't had the tools yet to see the full picture. That old model has since been completely overturned. Researchers have now identified more than 100 different genes that contribute to eye color, all interacting with each other in complicated, sometimes unpredictable ways. Two of those genes matter more than almost any others. They're called OCA2 and HERC2, and they both live on chromosome 15, sitting right next to each other. OCA2 is responsible for producing a protein that helps mature the tiny structures inside your cells that manufacture and store melanin. HERC2, meanwhile, acts almost like a dimmer switch, controlling how active OCA2 is allowed to be. If HERC2 turns OCA2 activity way down, you end up with very little melanin and light-colored eyes. If it lets OCA2 run freely, you get rich, dark brown eyes. Everything in between produces the wide spectrum of hazel, green, amber, and gray that we see across the human population. None of this would be known today without large-scale genetic studies that compare the DNA of thousands of people against their actual eye color, photographed and cataloged in careful detail. Scientists call this kind of research a genome-wide association study, and it works by scanning the entire genetic code of large groups of volunteers, looking for tiny variations that show up more often in people with one eye color compared to people with another. Over the past 2 decades, these studies have repeatedly confirmed that the HERC2 and OCA2 region on chromosome 15 is the single strongest predictor of whether someone ends up with blue or brown eyes. But they've also uncovered dozens of smaller genetic contributors layered on top of that main signal, each nudging the final shade slightly toward green, slightly toward gray, or slightly toward a deeper, richer brown. Some of this research has even found that the genetic markers influencing eye color differ somewhat between populations, with certain variants playing a bigger role in people of European descent, and different variants carrying more weight in people of East Asian or South Asian descent. It's a reminder that human pigmentation in all its forms is genuinely one of the more genetically complicated traits scientists have ever tried to map. so that's how ordinary eye color gets decided. But heterochromia isn't about your genes deciding on one final color for your whole body. It's about something going differently in one eye compared to the other, and there are several distinct ways that can happen. The first, and probably the one people picture when they hear the word heterochromia, is complete heterochromia. This is when one entire eye is a totally different color from the other. One eye might be a deep brown, and the other a clear pale blue. It's striking, it's rare, and it's the version most likely to make you do a double take when you meet someone who has it. Then there's sectoral heterochromia, sometimes called partial heterochromia. Instead of two whole eyes differing from each other, a single iris contains two different colors within itself. You might see a mostly blue eye with a wedge of brown cutting through part of it, almost like someone dropped a splash of a different color onto the iris and it never fully blended in. And finally, there's central heterochromia, which is actually the most common of the three, even though it's still rare overall. This is when the ring of color immediately surrounding the pupil is a different shade than the rest of the iris. It often creates a kind of starburst pattern, with one color radiating out from the center and a different color taking over toward the outer edge. Central heterochromia shows up more frequently in people with lighter base eye colors like blue, green, or gray, likely because lighter irises already have less melanin overall, which makes any unevenness in pigment distribution far more visible. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because heterochromia doesn't have just one cause. It has several, and they come from completely different biological processes. The first path is the one most people assume is the only path, straightforward inheritance. In some cases, heterochromia really is passed down through families, the same way eye color itself is. Researchers have documented cases where this trait follows what's called an autosomal dominant pattern, meaning if one parent carries the genetic variant responsible, there's a real chance it gets passed directly to their children. In these inherited cases, a person is simply born with a genetic blueprint that produces different amounts of melanin in each eye from the very start, without any outside disruption, injury, illness, or unusual event happening at any point during development, before birth or after it. If you have relatives with heterochromia and you were born with it yourself, this inherited route is probably your answer. But here's the twist that a lot of people don't know. A huge portion of heterochromia cases aren't inherited in that clean, straightforward way at all. Instead, they come from something called a somatic mutation. To understand what that means, you have to picture what's happening in the womb during early development. As an embryo grows, its cells are dividing over and over again, copying DNA billions of times to build every organ, every limb, every structure of the body, including the eyes. Most of the time, that copying process is remarkably accurate. But every so often, in a tiny fraction of dividing cells, a small error slips through. If that error happens to occur in a cell responsible for developing melanin-producing structures in the eye, and it happens after the left and right eye have already started developing somewhat separately, you can end up with two eyes that received slightly different genetic instructions, purely by biological accident. This isn't inherited from mom or dad at all. It's a mutation that essentially happened to you individually during your own development, and it's unlikely to appear anywhere else in your family tree, past or future. This is honestly one of the most underappreciated facts about heterochromia. Most people assume that if they have it, it must run in the family, or that if it doesn't run in the family, something must be medically wrong with them. In reality, a random developmental mutation limited entirely to eye pigmentation is one of the more common explanations, and by itself, it's completely harmless. It's simply a quirk of cellular copying that happened to land in exactly the right place to change how melanin distributed itself between two eyes that otherwise look completely healthy. Then there's a cause that sounds like something out of science fiction, but is very real, and it's called genetic mosaicism. Normally, every cell in your body is supposed to carry an identical copy of your DNA, the same genetic code you inherited at conception. But in mosaicism, something disrupts that uniformity early on, and the body ends up containing two or more genetically distinct populations of cells, all coexisting within the same person. If one of those genetically different cell populations happens to end up concentrated in one eye, and a different population dominates the other eye, you can end up with heterochromia as a visible signal of an invisible genetic patchwork running through your body. In most cases, this kind of mosaicism causes no other symptoms at all, and the only outward sign that anything unusual happened during development is the color difference between the eyes. And then there's the cause that tends to shock people the most when they first hear about it: chimerism. This is exceptionally rare, but it is medically documented, and it might be the strangest possible explanation for having two different colored eyes. A human chimera is someone who began life as two separate fertilized embryos, essentially fraternal twins. But at a very early stage of pregnancy, before either embryo had developed very far, the two merged into a single developing individual. Instead of being born as twins, that person is born as one single body, but carrying two genetically distinct sets of DNA within different regions of their own tissue, quietly coexisting for their entire life. Most people who are chimeras never find out, because the two genetic profiles blended so seamlessly that there's no visible sign of it anywhere. But in some rare cases, that hidden duality shows up exactly where you'd expect a color difference to be most obvious: the eyes. If the cells responsible for pigmenting one eye trace back to one twin's original genetic code, and the cells pigmenting the other eye trace back to the other twin's code, the result can be two eyes that are, quite literally, genetically different from each other, belonging to what started out as two separate individuals. Sit with that for a second. If you meet someone with two different colored eyes, there's a small but real chance that what you're looking at is the physical echo of a twin who never got the chance to be born as a separate person, absorbed so early and so completely into a single developing body that the only remaining trace is a color difference in the iris. Chimerism doesn't just affect eye color when it happens, either. In documented human chimera cases, doctors have occasionally found patches of skin with slightly different pigmentation, blood that contains two distinct genetic profiles depending on which sample is tested, and in a handful of extraordinary legal cases, DNA paternity or maternity tests that came back showing a parent wasn't genetically related to their own biological child, simply because the reproductive cells tested happened to carry the genetic signature of the absorbed twin, rather than the twin who was actually born. Those cases made headlines precisely because they sound almost impossible, yet they're a direct, well-documented consequence of the exact same biological process that, in a much smaller and far more common way, can leave someone with two different colored eyes and absolutely nothing else unusual about their health at all. It's a striking example of how a single rare event during the earliest days of pregnancy can ripple forward in ways that only become visible decades later, sometimes as nothing more than a beautiful, unexpected eye color. Of course, not every case of heterochromia originates before birth. The eyes can also end up two different colors later in life through what's called acquired heterochromia, and this version has a completely different set of explanations, some of them medical and worth knowing about. Physical trauma to the eye is one of the more straightforward causes. An injury that damages the iris, whether from an accident, an impact, or a surgical procedure, can trigger inflammation or scarring that permanently changes how much pigment shows in that eye compared to the other. The body's healing response to that kind of damage doesn't always restore the original coloring evenly, and the result can be a visible, lasting color shift. Certain medications are also known to gradually change iris pigmentation over time, and this one surprises a lot of people. Some glaucoma treatments, particularly a category of eye drops used to lower pressure inside the eye, have a documented side effect of darkening the iris, sometimes only in the treated eye if the other eye wasn't receiving the same medication. There's also a well-known cosmetic treatment used to promote longer, thicker eyelashes that shares a similar active ingredient family, and it carries the same potential side effect. People using it on their lashes have, in rare instances, noticed their iris color shifting subtly darker over months of continuous use, purely as an unintended consequence of the formula interacting with pigment-producing cells near the eye. What makes this particular side effect so interesting from a genetic standpoint is that it isn't random. The medication is essentially nudging the same melanin production pathway that OCA2 and HERC2 regulate naturally, just from the outside in, rather than from a person's own DNA. It's a rare real-world example of a chemical compound reaching into the exact same biological machinery that genes normally control, and producing a very similar visible result, a permanently darker iris, but through a completely different route than genetics alone. Beyond injury and medication, heterochromia can also be a visible signal of an underlying medical condition. And this is the category where it's genuinely worth paying attention if the color change appears suddenly in adulthood, rather than being present since childhood. Certain inherited syndromes are associated with heterochromia as one of several features, often involving changes to pigmentation more broadly across the skin and hair, not just the eyes. Other conditions affecting the nervous system, including some that involve disruption to nerve signals reaching the eye, have also been linked to eye color changes, particularly when heterochromia develops on just one side of the face alongside other symptoms like a drooping eyelid or a smaller pupil. There are also rarer conditions involving inflammation inside the eye itself, sometimes tied to broader autoimmune or inflammatory processes in the body that can cause gradual pigment loss or pigment change confined to just one iris. This is exactly why doctors draw such a firm line between congenital heterochromia, meaning the kind you're born with, and acquired heterochromia, meaning the kind that shows up later. If you've had different colored eyes since childhood and nothing else has changed, it's almost always nothing more than an interesting, harmless genetic trait, no different in medical significance than having a widow's peak or attached earlobes. But if an adult suddenly notices one eye changing color when it never used to be different, that's generally considered worth mentioning to an eye doctor, simply because it can occasionally be an early sign of something else going on that deserves a closer look. The color change itself usually isn't dangerous. It's more that it can act as an external clue pointing toward an internal process worth investigating. Doctors have a fairly consistent approach when someone comes in asking about a color difference between their eyes. The first question is almost always about timing, because timing tells you almost everything you need to know before a single test is even run. Has this been present since infancy, visible in old childhood photographs, and consistent for as long as anyone can remember? If so, the conversation is usually short and reassuring, because that pattern lines up perfectly with a congenital cause, whether that's inherited, a developmental mutation, or mosaicism, none of which require treatment or ongoing monitoring. But if the color shift is new, if a photograph from a few years ago clearly shows two matching eyes and a recent one doesn't, that's when a more thorough eye exam becomes worthwhile, checking for signs of inflammation, previous injury, medication effects, or, in rare instances, something happening with the nerves that help regulate the eye. It's worth being clear that even in the acquired category, the overwhelming majority of cases turn out to be benign or explainable by something like an eye drop side effect. Heterochromia showing up later in life is far more often a curious footnote than a red flag, but it is one of those traits that's always worth mentioning to an eye doctor, simply so it can be properly documented and, if needed, monitored over time. It's also worth putting some real numbers around how rare all of this actually is, because heterochromia has a reputation for being far more common than it truly is, largely thanks to how visually striking it looks whenever it does appear. Across that general population, heterochromia in any form is estimated to affect somewhere around 1% of people. And complete heterochromia, the dramatic version with two fully different colored eyes, is rarer still than the sectoral or central varieties. Central heterochromia, with its subtle starburst pattern radiating from the pupil, is technically the most frequently observed type, though it often goes unnoticed unless someone is looking closely, especially in people with naturally light-colored eyes where the pattern is easiest to see. There's another detail that tends to surprise people. Heterochromia isn't unique to humans at all. It shows up across the animal kingdom too, and in some species, it's actually far more common than it is in people. Certain dog breeds, like huskies and Australian shepherds, are well known for frequently displaying one blue eye and one brown eye, often linked to specific coat color genetics that happen to have a strong effect on eye pigmentation as well. Cats show similar patterns, particularly certain white-coated breeds, where the genetics controlling white fur and eye pigmentation are closely intertwined, sometimes producing one blue eye alongside one green or gold eye. Even some horses display heterochromia, often called a wall eye in that context. And it's especially common in certain patterned coat types where large patches of unpigmented skin already disrupt the normal spread of melanin across the body. Some breeders and researchers have even used the consistent appearance of heterochromia in specific breeds as a kind of natural case study, helping confirm just how tightly linked coat pigmentation genes and eye pigmentation genes really are, since the same underlying pathways that color a husky's fur also happen to color its irises. Watching how consistently this trait pops up across such different species is actually a great reminder of just how universal and how delicately balanced the genetics of pigmentation really are across the animal world, not just in humans. It also reinforces something worth remembering. Heterochromia isn't a malfunction or a flaw. It's simply what happens when an already complicated pigment distribution system produces a slightly different, but still perfectly functional, result in two places instead of one. So where does all of this leave us? If you have two different colored eyes, or you know someone who does, the honest answer to where that trait comes from isn't a single, tidy explanation. It could be a straightforward inherited variant passed down from a parent, following the same genetic logic as any other family trait. It could be a random, harmless mutation that occurred purely by chance while your eyes were still forming in the womb, unconnected to anything in your family history at all. It could be genetic mosaicism, a hidden patchwork of slightly different DNA quietly coexisting within your own body. In exceptionally rare cases, it could even be the lingering biological trace of a twin absorbed early in pregnancy, meaning two different sets of DNA are technically present within one single person. Or, if the change appeared later in life rather than from birth, it could be the result of an old injury, certain medications, or occasionally an underlying condition worth having checked out by a doctor. What ties all of these explanations together is something worth appreciating. Eye color, something most of us take completely for granted, is actually the product of an extraordinarily intricate, finely tuned biological process. More than 100 genes, multiple cell types, precise timing during embryonic development, and delicate regulation of a single pigment all have to align correctly to produce whatever color your eyes end up being. Given just how many moving parts are involved, It's almost more surprising that heterochromia is rare than it would be if it were common. Every single day, across billions of people, this remarkably complex system usually produces two matching eyes without a hitch. When it doesn't, when something shifts just slightly in one eye but not the other, the result is one of the most visually captivating traits a human being can have. And now, thanks to modern genetics, we finally understand exactly why. So the next time you meet someone with two different colored eyes, or catch a glimpse of your own in the mirror if you happen to have this trait yourself, you're not just looking at a curiosity or a genetic fluke with no explanation. You're looking at one of several possible stories written directly into that person's biology. An inherited family trait, a spontaneous mutation from early development, a quiet genetic mosaic, or in the rarest cases, the physical remnant of a twin who never got to exist separately. Science spent centuries treating this trait as an unexplained mystery. Today, it isn't a mystery anymore, it's biology, written in extraordinary detail, right there in the color of someone's eyes. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with the longest. A trait that once got explained away with folklore, superstition, and half-formed guesses now has a real evidence-based story behind it, one built from genome studies, embryology, decades of documented medical cases, and even the occasional startling discovery about hidden twins. It's a small, visible reminder of just how much is happening beneath the surface of a body that, from the outside, looks completely ordinary. Two eyes, sitting just inches apart, can end up carrying entirely different genetic stories. And for most of human history, nobody had any way of knowing why. Now we do, and that knowledge doesn't make the trait any less beautiful. If anything, understanding the biology behind it only makes it more remarkable, because what looks like a simple visual quirk turns out to be one of the clearest windows we have into the sheer complexity and occasional surprise of human development itself.